Hello dear viewers and welcome to this series of lectures on biodiversity. Today I'll be talking about global distribution patterns of biodiversity with particular reference to the latitudinal species diversity gradient. But before we talk about the patterns of biodiversity, let's first of all know what biodiversity means. Biodiversity is defined as the variety and variability in living organisms and their ecological complex. And in a broader perspective, biodiversity refers to the number, abundance, and composition of genotypes, species, populations, functional types, communities, and landscape units in a given system. We generally talk about biodiversity at different levels, and most commonly used levels of biodiversity include ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. By ecosystem diversity, we mean when we have different types of ecosystems, say lakes, wetlands, rivers, forests, grasslands, each having distinct set of attributes and as such distinct composition of species. And when we talk about species diversity, that means how many different kinds of species do we have. And even within the species, we have at times the variation which we address at the genetic level, what we call as genetic diversity. And so for this species diversity is concerned, this is the most commonly used level of biodiversity, and it has two important components. One is the species richness, what we also call as the variety component, which means how many different kinds of species do we have in a given system. And second is the species evenness, or what we also sometimes call as equitability component, which refers to the how evenly species are distributed in a system. And when we are talking about biodiversity or its levels, then the question of scale is very important. Why? Because the scale helps us in the detection of patterns, and also identification of causal mechanisms depend upon this scale. And so for spatial levels of biodiversity are concerned, let me tell you that the richness of species in a given region is a function of two important types. The richness of habitat types or small areas in a given system that compose it, and the turnover of species within those habitats. And in this perspective, we distinguish between different kinds of spatial levels of biodiversity, such as, say, point diversity, which refers to the richness of a subset of a community, or alpha diversity, which means the discrete number of species in a given habitat. Then the beta diversity, which means the comparative number of or turnover of species between the habitats. Then the gamma diversity, which means a discrete number of species at a large unit, say a landscape level. Then delta diversity, whereby we mean the comparative number or the turnover of species within the landscapes. And sometimes we also use the term epsilon diversity, which means richness of a broad geographical area that comprises of many landscape units. Although very convincing and reasonable, these are arbitrary distinctions along a continuum of different scales. But out of these things, let me tell you the latitudinal species diversity gradient, that is the latitudinal decrease in the number of species when we go from tropics to poles, or vice versa, that's increase in the number of species when we come from poles to the equator or tropics. It is one of the ecology's most well-recognized, oldest and fundamental patterns concerning the distribution of life on Earth. The first important question here is, why to understand the gradient of biodiversity along a latitudinal scale? What makes it more important? Let me tell you, there are n number of reasons. More specifically, there are, say, for example, it gives us an idea of the factors that influence the diversity gradient or the variation in the number of species. And understanding the factors influences the understanding of our conservation strategies, how to conserve them. And most important of all, this has very important evolutionary implications. And let me tell you once again here that in fact latitudinal gradient of diversity depends ultimately on the historical, geographical, biotic, abiotic and stochastic forces which affect the geometry, internal structure, and location of species range in ecological and evolutionary times. In fact, latitude in itself is a surrogate for a number of primary environmental variables or gradients. For example, temperature, insolation, seasonality, and so on, which interact and are correlated with each other in many ways, making the direct tests of hypotheses at times difficult. Now, before we talk about the pattern of species diversity along a latitudinal scale, let me tell you something brief about its historical development. The broad recognition of the latitudinal gradient in fact occurred in somewhere in 1800s, with the emphasis on quantification from 1950s. That means quantitative studies to measure the gradient of biodiversity at a latitudinal scale started from 1950s onwards, wherein Robert Pianka made a significant contribution, who came out with some good hypotheses and explanatory theories. And a number of reviews have come up after 1980 or 1990, and even recently, which have set a stage for a debate on different factors that determine this diversity. At present, about more than 30 hypotheses exist in the literature explaining different facets of this latitudinal species diversity gradient. However, to understand the most plausible explanations, 8 most widely accepted hypotheses will be discussed in the present lecture, which have been categorized for your easy understanding into 2 categories: biotic explanations and abiotic explanations. So for biotic hypotheses or explanations are concerned, they include: number 1, spatial heterogeneity hypothesis; number 2, species interaction hypothesis; number 3, predation hypothesis; and number 4, animal pollination hypothesis. And so for the abiotic explanations or hypotheses are concerned, it includes: number 1, time hypothesis; second, climate stability and area hypothesis; number 3, productivity hypothesis; and number 4, evolutionary speed hypothesis. In this part of the lecture, we will focus our attention only on the biotic explanations of this latitudinal species diversity gradient. And let's start with the first explanation, that is the spatial heterogeneity hypothesis. So for spatial heterogeneity is concerned, it includes 2 important things: biotic spatial heterogeneity, that means heterogeneity in space caused due to the presence of different kinds of living organisms belonging to different life forms, especially of plants. And second is the number and patchiness of habitats. And this part we can also categorize, of course, or discuss into the abiotic explanations. And third is the physical heterogeneity also. Now, let me tell you, so for more plant species in tropics support higher number of herbivore species, hence more carnivore species. That means the number of different species of plants, more number of different species of plants, in fact, provides more number of habitats or hiding places for different kinds of other trophic levels. And richness of vegetation increases herbivore species diversity by 2 important reasons, or by 2 important ways. Number 1, increasing the number of monophagous herbivores directly. That means those herbivores which just feed on this specific plant species. And second is creating more structural complexity, which affords more niches for herbivores to occupy. In fact, when habitat is structurally more complex, n number of, say, hiding places are created for new species to exist, and this automatically increases the number of species in tropics. And the best evidence in support of this theory has been provided by MacArthur and MacArthur somewhere in 1961, who related the bird species diversity to both plant species diversity and richness of foliage heights along this diversity gradient. In fact, this theory has certain loopholes and it has been criticized. The most important criticism of this theory is that it fails to address, at first place, why there do exist more number of species in tropics. So the second explanation is the species interaction hypothesis, sometimes also referred in the literature as the competition hypothesis. Let me tell you here that in the fairly predictable environment of tropics, where conditions are by and large more favorable. Species tend to interact more and compete very keenly with each other, leading to what we call as niche narrowing in ecological terms and close packing of species along the resource axes. That means more number of species existing in the tropics fully exploit the resource axes that's available there. And that's why you will find at times the tropical soils are nutrient poor as compared to the temperate or other soils, because whatever nutrients we have in the soils, they are locked up in the biomass. There are n number of microorganisms in the soil always active that change these nutrients so fast, and n number of plant species always present that take them up very immediately. Now, the increased intensity of competition or mutualism in tropics facilitates greater species richness. Thus, competition may lead to more species per unit area or per unit habitat or space, thereby allowing more prey species to coexist in the tropics. That's very important. And this theory again is not without criticisms. And the most important criticism of this hypothesis is that it does not have much empirical data for its support. Moreover, interspecific interactions may be more costly at lower latitudes, lower altitudes also, where, for example, organisms invest more resources or more energy in combating parasitism or other things. Then the next explanation is the predation hypothesis. Of course, predation also we can discuss as a biological interaction, but why I discuss it here separately is that it almost runs contrary to what we have discussed in the competition theory. This predation hypothesis was in fact proposed by Robert Penny somewhere in 1966, and it argues that more numerous predators in tropics and more numerous parasites also in tropics hold prey populations down to such levels that more resources remain and competition is reduced, thereby allowing more species to exist. This is very important for you to understand, because when competition is reduced, the resource axis in the system existing is not fully exploited, and as such, new species can come, colonize the system, and exploit the rest of the resources. And as I told you, this is contrary to the competition hypothesis that says that keen competition narrows the niches and leads to the full exploitation of the resource axis. The best evidence of this theory is from a famous experiment by this man, Robert Penny, what we call as starfish experiment, wherein he studied the impact of starfish, which acts as a top predator in the coastal communities. What he did was he basically removed the starfish disaster, what we call as, from certain habitats and not from the others. And what he found was that removing starfish from the system led to considerable decrease in the number of species, suggesting thereby that it is this top predator that functions to maintain the number of species to the higher side. Of course, again, this theory is not without criticisms, and the most important criticism of this theory is that it does not explain why there are more predators and parasites in the tropics in the first place. And again, let me tell you, there is not much empirical data to support this hypothesis. In fact, when we talk about these biological interactions, it's very hard to quantitatively study these interactions in the field, and as such, both of these theories suffer from this criticism that they do not have sufficient empirical data to support them. Next is the animal pollination hypothesis. Again, a very interesting hypothesis. In tropics, you must be knowing that winds are less frequent and of lower intensity than in other temperate regions or other areas. Thus, the most tropical plants are not pollinated by wind, but by animals, including insects, birds, bats, etc. And even some plant species which are pollinated by wind, typically throughout the rest of the world, are pollinated in tropics by the insect species or some other animal species. And what happens because of this animal pollination is that close association builds up between the plant and its specific pollinator, thus increasing the reproductive isolation between populations. This is very important, and consequently this leads to the increased rate of speciation. That means the rate at which new species are created is much faster in tropics because of this specific association between the pollinator and the plant species, which promotes the number of species overall in the tropics as compared to rest of the biogeographical areas. This theory is again not without criticism. The most important criticism is that, of course, it appears attractive apparently. This theory cannot explain easily the similar diversity gradients that do exist in aquatic ecosystems, where plant-pollinator relationships are not so significant or not so specific, because water acts as a conduit for the pollens from one partner to the other partner. So in this lecture, we have talked about the different biotic explanations. To begin with, we talked about what biodiversity is and what are the different levels at which we talk about biodiversity. And then I try to define the latitudinal species diversity gradient for you. And I told you why this gradient is important. In fact, it is a surrogate of so many other factors that do influence the biodiversity or the richness of species along this gradient. And then I also talked about some brief historical developments, how from 1800s, when the concept was in fact conceptualized, how it first developed after 1950 by the experiments of Robert Bianca and so on. And at present, we have more than 30 explanations existing for this. And in this lecture, we talked only about biotic explanations, out of which we talked about spatial heterogeneity theory, along with its criticism. Then we talked about animal pollination theory. We also talked about the species interaction theory, which in other words, I also told you earlier, is called as competition theory. I told you both of these theories, predation theory and the competition theory, suffer because of having less empirical data to their support. And then this predation theory and competition theory, they do also run contrary to each other. To talk about the abiotic explanations, we will meet in the next lecture. Till then, goodbye.